Welcome to the CSBP Fertilisers Grow Better podcast, sharing knowledge with growers on leading crop nutrition, sustainable agriculture and other issues impacting the agricultural industry.
G'day everyone, welcome to another edition of the CSBP Grow Better podcast. My name's Grey Johnston and I'm very pleased to be joined today by two special guests, Chris Gendle, our Lab Operations Manager, and Lois Kowald, our Senior Account Manager at Nutrition and Sales. Chris, Lois, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Now, our topic today is the science behind soil sampling. But before we get into that, keen to just get to know each of you a little better. Lois, if we start with you, you're our Senior Account Manager based out in Wongan Hills area.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little about yourself and how you came to the business and your history and what you're up to?
Yeah, definitely. So I started with CSBP in 2018, straight out of Curtin Uni as an agribusiness graduate. I started based in Katanning as a trainee area manager and I was there for a few months. I then moved to Wongan Hills, taking on the account manager role there. So working with growers in the Wongan, Dalwallini and Killarney areas, and then more recently, earlier this year, moving into a senior account manager role.
And how is the season, shaping up or finishing off in the areas that you're looking after at the moment?
Yeah, well, we've been really lucky with the start of the season. We had some really good consistent rainfalls that got the crop up and going, and then we've just had some exceptional spring rains, so that's been amazing to finish the crop off. It should mean some good grain weights and yields around, so early harvest reports are really promising, so it's really exciting.
Fingers crossed that continues. Thank you for that update. Chris, you've been with the CSBP Lab for some time now. Do you want to tell us a bit about your background and your role at the lab?
Yeah, sure. So I have a chemistry background. I've first joined the lab in 2009 as a lab tech. I've had a couple of roles within the lab, being a chemist for some time, and I've been the operations manager there since 2017.
And can you tell us a little bit then about what's the history of the CSBP Lab and what goes on there?
Yeah, so the lab's been there as a service since 1971. So initially set up to serve WA customers, to understand their soil and plant better, to be able to make better decisions in the field. The lab is now a national lab, but still has a very strong focus on WA. And at the moment we're kind of in between seasons. So we've finished the plant testing and we're gearing up for what's hopefully going to be a big summer of soil testing. And
you've just come back from the ASPAC board meeting or AGM. Can you tell us a little bit about ASPAC and what's your involvement there and how that organisation is relevant to the lab? Yeah, so ASPAC's easier to say than Australasian Soil and Plant Analysis Council, which is a long name, but effectively it's the industry body for soil and plant testing. So it exists to make sure that labs are providing reliable results. The main way it does that is through its proficiency testing program. So it sends out blind samples to labs. Labs need to report results within a certain level to get certification, and then that feeds into FertCare advice as well. So you can't provide a FertCare recommendation unless you're using a lab that's got ASPAC certification for the right tests. That leads nicely then to the topic of our discussion today, and we thought that our listeners out there would be interested in understanding a little more about what goes on in the lab and then how that relates to the nutrition recommendation that they get from our sales team. So we've brought you two here together, the dynamic duo, to tell us about how our growers can get benefit from soil testing and how the systems work together, the lab working hand in glove with our agronomy and sales teams to provide those nutrition recommendations. So if we work through a few of the different soil tests, maybe pH is the right place to start. Chris, can you start us off? Tell us about the test and then maybe Lois, what's the relevance of that test to growers? Yeah, sure. So, the pH test, we take a 1 in 5 water extract of the sample after it's been dried and ground. Then it goes on to our robotic analyzers, so we don't have people sitting there doing it. We process a lot of samples. So we're using a pH probe. So pH probe works by measuring the potential from hydrogen ions compared to a reference. The instrument takes a reading every second. Once the result's settled, it records it and moves on to the next sample. And then the relevance of that from a grower perspective, Lois?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess the pH is a measure of the soil's acidity or alkalinity, and why that is important is because different individual nutrients, their availability is impacted on that soil pH. So for an example, aluminium becomes more available at a low pH, and alternatively an element like manganese becomes less available at higher pHs. So it's important to know that to have a greater understanding of the availability of the soil nutrients. So different crop types also have different sensitivities to different pHs. So lupins are more tolerant to lower pHs. So that can be a good knowledge for the grower to use, different management practices to plant crop types that are more suited to those soil types to get the best result out of that ground.
And we've seen a big uptick in lime application in WA over the last 10, 20 years. Is that something you've seen coming through the lab, Chris? You see the pH materially coming up?
I've probably just noticed more samples coming through and more at depth over my time at the lab. It's become a much bigger issue, I think WA soils have always been quite acidic, but then sometimes we do see a subsample come through and it's quite alkaline, where there must have been some lime band or something like that that's come through.
Definitely very important to test to at least 30 centimetres to assess the pH down the profile. Even if lime has been applied historically, it may not have ameliorated that pH at depth, particularly if there hasn't been any incorporation through deep ripping or anything. So it just gives growers a lot better understanding of that profile and can help them target a liming regime based on those depth samples.
Moving on then to P, and Kowald P is, I guess, a test we hear a lot about and we talk about, and clearly relevant to P application. Chris, can you tell us a bit about how that test and how you figure out the PBI?
Yeah. So they both work together, those two tests. So if we start with Kowald P, it's an overnight extract. So we're mixing soil with sodium bicarb to try and get some ion exchange and draw out the available phosphorus within the soil. We're not looking for for total. We're looking for what's going to be plant available. So we end up with a phosphate result, and that's measured using a really cool piece of kit called a flow injection analyzer, where we're getting a small little peak. The area of that peak is proportional to the amount of phosphorus in the sample, and at the end you get this little blue colour coming through if there's lots of phosphorus. The PBI test is also an overnight extract. We effectively add 100 ppm of phosphorus to a soil and measure what's left there the next day. So it's a measure of, sure, you might have low phosphorus, you might want to throw heaps of phosphorus onto your soil, but there's only so much that the soil can uptake. And the Kowald P result actually feeds into the PBI calculation. Because the amount of P you start with is going to affect how much P can be absorbed by that same soil.
And Lois, clearly that's a test of relevance to growers in WA?
Yeah, definitely. It's very critical. Basically, phosphorus is the building blocks for crop nutrition, and it's very important in the early growth stage of the crop. So interpreting the Kowald P and PBI results, the PBI is critical to add that context around the Kowald P level. What the PBI tells us is what that soil's ability is to tie up phosphorus. So typically low PBI soils, which are sands, they have less ability to tie up phosphorus, which means there's more available for the plant to uptake. There's a few things that affect the availability of phosphorus. One of those again is pH. So a low pH reduces the availability of phosphorus, so that's important to be aware of. And there's other factors that we also take into account when we're doing a phosphorus recommendation, which is the gravel percentage. So if you have a high soil gravel percentage, that increases the demand for phosphorus, and also your target yield. So the higher the demand of a high target yield, the more phosphorus that we need to supply to that crop. So
Cole was a busy bloke because he also has a K test. Is it the same, Colwell?
Yeah, it's the same extract. We're able to take a K result from that overnight bicarb extract, and we use atomic absorption spectroscopy to get the total K within that test tube, and it approximates very closely with an exchangeable K.
So this similar kind of concept, is that the same like a plant available K? Is that the way to think about it?
Yeah.
So Lois, I guess when we're testing for K, we also often talk about testing to depth. Is that particularly important?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can see that nutrients decline down the profile, typically on those lighter soil types. So it's very important to test to at least 30 centimetres to get a better understanding of those nutrient levels down the profile. If we're seeing K levels deplete, then it can help us, understand that we might have a higher requirement for potassium. So the value in soil sampling and gathering that data set is as important for next year planning, your fertiliser requirements as it is, an asset going forward. Once we've, built that data set and collected it, it also gives us a great opportunity to track those nutrient levels over time. Decipher Ag is now an excellent program that allows us to visualise that data and, pull up individual soil samples and track those levels over time, especially with the increase in variable rate technology and growers wanting to utilise that as an option to try and save on their fertiliser spend. I think having a bank of soil sample data allows you to make better decisions around that.
And so the Kowald K test then, Lois, clearly of importance to our growers in providing a recommendation to them as well?
Yeah, definitely. Potassium is a critical nutrient that is needed by the plant in large amounts. So it's the second highest most demanded nutrient by the crop. About 80% of what the plant requires in nitrogen, it requires in potassium, and also about 6 to 8 times more demand than there is of phosphorus. So that basically highlights the importance of potassium to the crop. A few things that it helps support is increasing water use efficiency and also nitrogen use efficiency. Basically makes the crop more resilient to stresses when it's sufficiently supplied with potassium.
So we've touched on P, we've touched on K. I guess the last of our macronutrients is maybe N, or maybe N and S. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about, organic carbon tests and then how they're relevant to N and why that might be of interest?
Yeah, so organic carbon we test in the lab using oxidation. We mix a sample with some sulfuric acid and sodium dichromate, which is this orange coloured mix. And then if there's high amount of organic carbon, then oxidation will occur. And you'll see the test tubes change from this orange colour to a bluey green kind of colour. So organic carbon, I guess, I'm sure Lois can talk more about it, is a sign of soil health.
Yeah, well, definitely I think, the organic carbon, it's basically a measurable component of the soil's organic matter. The organic carbon mineralises throughout the season at different rates dependent on what the soil temperature and moisture content is. But basically it's very key for, the few key nutrients that are being mineralised from that organic carbon pool are nitrogen, phosphorus and sulphur. Typically, there's a higher likelihood of getting a nitrogen response on low organic carbon soils just due to the fact that there's less nitrogen being supplied by that soil. Therefore, there's a greater demand for nitrogen fertiliser to be able to fulfil that potential of the crop.
And are there other tests then that we include in the regime for nitrogen in addition to organic carbon?
So we do a KCl extract of soils to determine mineralisable ammonium and nitrate. We again use my favourite piece of kit, the flow injection analyzer, where we're mixing the sample with different colouring reagents and come off with a cool colour at the end that's very accurately measured.
Brilliant. So we've heard a number of times on the CSBP Grow Better podcast around the 30-33 rule and how that's relevant to soil sampling and thinking about your program. Can you just tell us, Lois, around what does that rule mean and how should growers be thinking about setting up their soil sampling program for the year?
Yeah, definitely. Well, we recommend that growers soil sample every 3 years to 30 centimetres with a sample every 30 hectares. So that is, a consistent approach to build a reliable data set that can be then used to make good fertiliser decisions going forward.
So once growers plan their samples in Decipher Ag, samples have been collected, they come through to you at the lab, Chris, for analysis. Can you talk us through the process from that point?
Yeah, so the lab receives the sample, hopefully in a barcoded sample bag, where we're able to just scan the barcode, upload all the test requirements, and then the samples get dried, ground, and put through the lab for the required tests. Once it goes through the lab, we perform some quality checks on the sample. So we repeat about 10% of what we do, just to make sure that we're confident in the result before the report gets sent off, and with a new logic interpretation if required.
And so how much, it sounds like you're doing a whole lot of different samples on that one little bit of soil. How much soil do you need to do a good analysis?
Yeah, so there's a little line on the sample bag, but it's 150 grams of dried soil is what we need to a typical standard test. But yeah, it's difficult to work out how much that is in the field, because obviously if it's been raining, a lot of that weight goes once it goes through the drying ovens.
And so you've analysed the sample, you've got the results, you've pushed them back through the system into New Logic. That's where you start to play a role here, Lois?
Yeah, that's right. We receive the completed soil sample results into New Logic. We can then put them into a report. So the power of New Logic is that it takes into account nutrient interactions as well as factors like pH. So all of those taken into account, as well as economics, to build a very robust recommendation for the grower.
It's really nice capability, and nice to hear about the integrated process we have at CSBP Fertilisers. And we're recording this now because clearly all of our teams, our lab team, our account manager team, our agronomy team, are gearing up for a soil sampling season. What does a soil sampling season look like for you, Chris?
Well, yeah, it's when it's a hive of activity at the lab. So a lot more people come into the lab. We go from doing a few hundred samples a day to a couple of thousand samples a day. And yeah, it's just all hands on deck.
And how long does the season last?
Yeah, so it tends to start around December, January, depending on how late harvest is. And we see it going full pump till about March. And then around Anzac Day, it starts to wither down at that point, because people have presumably then started to sow their next crop.
So, Chris, what are you up to for the rest of the year then? I mean, you can't just be...
Yeah, we obviously get other samples.
Yeah.
So, WA growers still make up the bulk of what we do. But yeah, we get samples from all across the country, from researchers as well. So there's still plenty to do to keep us busy. And then we also have the plant testing period around July, August, where people have an opportunity to see how their plants have performed and whether their soil recommendations come to fruition. The plant testing is really the source of truth. And there's also an opportunity to do an in-season application if you need to as well.
And we talked about ASPAC before, and you've just received another acronym, NATA accreditation for Total Soil Carbon Analysis. Can you tell us a bit about what that means and what that process was like?
Yeah, so look, it's I guess adding a bit more weight to what we already do. So I guess the driver for NATA is being able to test carbon for the purpose of emissions reduction fund, has NATA as a requirement. Yeah, the NATA process is really about making sure your systems and processes are well documented and robust. The ASPAC kind of looks at the results and, are we getting the right result? Then NATA is looking at, do we have the right processes? So an auditor comes in and it's open doors to the lab, open doors to the documentation, and check that everything's as it should be.
So we've heard about soil sampling season from Chris's perspective. Lois, what does it look like for you?
Yeah, well, we've already started that process basically with growers. We're, drafting soil sample plans and getting ready for early next year. As soon as the crop is off, then we'll get in the paddocks and start collecting those soil samples. I think the earlier we can get that ball rolling, the better. We get it into the lab, and before the turnaround times get too long, growers can get that data back. The first step they might use, in terms of decision making, was using those pH data to look at how much lime they might use for the coming season, get that organised, and then it's also very critical for us finalising our seeding fertiliser decisions, making sure that we're using the product that's best suited to their program.
And Lois, you mentioned two beautiful words, which I'm sure Chris recoiled at, turnaround times. Can you tell us a little bit about turnaround times at the lab, Chris, and what can impact that, and what are you committing to for this year?
What am I committing to? Yeah, so typically turnaround time's about 5 working days. We spoke before about overnight tests, and there's overnight drying and repeating about 10% of what we do. So there's limitations over how fast we can go. Things that could affect us for turnaround time is, if we get over capacity for samples, or if we have labour shortages and things like that. But the lab's been gearing up. We've been recruiting early. We've invested quite a lot in equipment in the lab to make sure that our throughput capacity is pretty high. And so, we're as well prepared as we can be.
You heard it here first on the CSBP Grow Better podcast, as well prepared as they can be. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Lois, for joining us today to talk about the science behind soil sampling and all things soil as they relate to WA growers. Really a pleasure to have you on, and really a pleasure to join all of you out there in podcast world. That's it for another episode of the CSBP Grow Better podcast. Remember to jump into our socials at CSBP Fertilisers, subscribe, rate and review the show, and let us know in the DMs if you've got any suggestions. But until the next time, it's thanks to Chris Gendle.
Thank you.
Thanks to Lois Kowald.
Thank you.
And I've been Grey Johnston. Thank you. Goodbye. See ya.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the CSBP Grow Better podcast. For more information about CSBP, please visit csbp-fertilisers.com.au or connect with us on social media at CSBP Fertilisers on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn.